Shadowgate 64, a descendant of its more illustrious forebear Shadowgate, which released for the Macintosh computer all the way back in 1987, along with pretty much every other console in and around that time as well, is a strange game, coming as it did during the midpoint of 1999, a time that saw a relative slew of absolutely massive summer blockbusters releasing, such as Driver, what a game that was, the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater as well, along with the legacy of Kane's Soul Reaver, hands down one of the greatest cinematic masterpieces ever released for a video games console. So while most people were outrunning cops down on Miami Beach, pulling off grinds inside a dilapidated warehouse in LA or wherever Tony Hawk's took place, or indeed settling matters with Kane and Raziel's quest for revenge, pretty much all the big releases of that summer came out within just a month of Shadowgate 64 dropping into stores, so it's fair to say that not many teenagers were super excited to play through an adventure that not only presented zero combat, but also added in a few mind-bending puzzles along the way in a game that definitely felt out of place on a late 90s console. Today we're going to dive into why Shadowgate 64 missed its mark with audiences and reviewers so much, whether its negative review scores upon release were indeed justified, and why it's been given a new lease of life recently with the modern resurgence of the Shadowgate formula. So buckle up as we travel through the bowels of Shadowgate Castle, playing as the intrepid halfling Del Cottonwood as he overcomes traps, searches for priceless treasure, and ultimately looks to escape from the clutches of the villainous warlock Lord Talamar. A villain, as they all are, intent on taking over the world. Generic, sure, but as we shall see, Shadowgate 64 Trials of the Four Towers is definitely not your average dungeon crawler. While the original Shadowgate game originally found its home on the PC, whether that be the Macintosh, the Amiga, the Atari ST or whatever, the game really came into its own on the most dominant home console of that time, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Up to that point, the NES had largely been a console filled up by side-scrollers, a few top-down RPGs, sports games and so on. When this first-person point-and-click adventure showed up on the system, which offered a highly immersive fantasy setting, along with a compelling atmosphere to boot, gamers were more than willing to give it a try. The NES port of Shadowgate was a major success for both Kemco and indeed ICOM Simulations as well, who were to collaborate on two further ports of ICOM's original IPs in both Deja Vu and Uninvited for the NES, along with some additional handheld ports also. Critics of the time were highly impressed with Shadowgate overall, citing its immersive atmosphere and polished quality, with one reviewer calling it technically, orally and visually superior to most of its competition. Just some of the many reasons why Shadowgate left such a lasting legacy on gamers towards the back end of the 1980s. Shadowgate's commercial and critical success, especially on the NES, led to ICOM Simulations unfortunately backing the wrong horse in the subsequent 16-bit console war that took place between Nintendo and Sega at the start of the 1990s, with ICOM bewilderingly given exclusive rights to NEC for the ill-fated, at least in terms of US and European appeal, TurboGrafx CD in 1993. The issue gets even more confusing when we consider that the game which released for the TurboGrafx CD, a supposed sequel to that original NES title, was not the one originally intended, with design documents from the time showing that game was modified heavily from its initial concept. The game mechanics and characters were heavily changed from that primary vision, with the sequel featuring platform elements also, a huge design shift from the first-person point-and-click adventure mechanics of the original game. Why this was done and why the design and story deviated so heavily from those original plans is anyone's guess, but thankfully those original ideas were eventually put together and restored in Zojoy's 2024 release of Beyond Shadowgate for PC, a game far more in line with that same vision for the sequel than the TurboGrafx CD outing. With the original Beyond Shadowgate being largely a critical and commercial dud for the TurboGrafx, ICOM Simulations went into administration and was eventually bought out by Viacom not long after, with its games library subsequently being sold off to Infinite Ventures, who acquired the rights to the Shadowgate series. Infinite Ventures didn't wait around too long to cash in on their new IP, porting the original Shadowgate game, which they renamed Shadowgate Classic, to various platforms, including Windows PC, the Game Boy Color, along with various other mobile devices into the early 2000s as well. However, Infinite Ventures had bigger plans than simply porting an old 1987 version of the original game around, and in the late 1990s paired up with Japanese developers Kemco, the developer responsible for the original NES port of the game in the 1980s, in order to try and bring back that old Shadowgate magic to a fresh console audience at the turn of the millennium. This was no doubt a risk, as by the time Shadowgate 64 finally hit store shelves in the summer of 1999, there was already a full 12-year gap to make up between it and its illustrious NES forebear, with 12 years being a relative lifetime back in the 1990s. You might see 3 or 4 console generations in that time span compared with today's more accepted GTA 6 and Elder Scrolls wait times.
Well, we're waiting.
After the contracts were signed with Nintendo, both Infinite Ventures and Kemco were hoping that the classic point-and-click formula of the original game would hold up under a newer audience, but unfortunately for both companies that just wasn't the case, with Shadowgate 64 ending up as a critical and commercial flop for Kemco, with IGN comparing it to a Turok game with no teeth, bemoaning the fact that the game had little to no combat, while N64 Magazine, the UK's biggest selling N64 magazine of the time, gave the game a measly 43%, saying that the only thing the game was good for was sending the player off into a deep slumber. These harsh criticisms and review scores turned into poor sales for Shadowgate 64, with the title shifting a criminally low 10,000 units in PAL regions, with an estimated 150,000 units worldwide, marking Kemco and Infinite Ventures' planned sequel to the game as effectively dead on arrival. But did it deserve this criticism? That's what we're going to find out in today's video, answering the question, does Shadowgate 64 still hold up? Now, before we get into the story and gameplay and all the rest of that good stuff, if you enjoy what we do over here at the RetroHauler, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, as it helps us out a ton. And as always, thank you for taking the time to watch. And now back to the video. As always, spoilers ahead for Shadowgate 64 Trials of the Four Towers as we delve into the concept, design, story elements and puzzle mechanics of this game, in our endeavour to find out if it still holds up. The story of the game begins with young Del Cottonwood, a halfling according to the manual at least, as he embarks upon a trade caravan across the land of Cal Torlin, and more accurately in the area immediately surrounding the infamous Castle Shadowgate. Since Lord Jair's defeat of the Warlock Lord in the first game, who was the protagonist in that original Shadowgate title, the land of Cal Torlin has descended into banditry and criminality. No surprise there, with the area around the now sinister Castle Shadowgate being among one of the worst regions in the entire land in which to travel. However, as we all know, trade must flow at the end of the day, so Del Cottonwood and his intrepid band of merchant adventurers set off forthwith, only to unsurprisingly get ambushed and attacked along the way, with the bandits killing all of the merchants save for Del, who was dragged away severely injured from the crash site. Now, while not a major criticism of the game, and to be fair, something that's explained in greater detail later on, I just can't wrap my head around the fact that this is supposed to be a halfling. I thought halflings looked like this, in fairness. To me, that's an elf.
He thinks he's an elf.
Thankfully, upon digging a little deeper, halflings in the Shadowgate universe are half-human, half-elf hybrids, hence the pointy ears and the smaller frame, and just knowing that bit of useless information alone has set my geek factor up by a full 20%. Poor Del is dragged off to the dungeons of Shadowgate Castle and is due for a summary execution, with our main goal at this point of the game being simply to escape. Thankfully, our nearby cellmate Agar provides us with a little backstory of the castle, as well as laying out the dangers we currently find ourselves in also. Once Del finds a way out of his cell through a conveniently placed trapdoor in the floor, he makes his way down to the sewer tunnel system and caves, managing to dig his way through with the help of a pickaxe a damaged section of ceiling within the cave system, which leads us to a storage room on the very first floor of the very first tower in the game, the Disciples Tower. Exploring the ground floor of the Disciples Tower lays out the formula for pretty much how the rest of the game will go, some ambient exploration combined with a bit of point-and-click style puzzle solving. Now, I personally really enjoy this kind of design if I am in the mood for it, as, you know, the pressure is off, there's no shambling corpses, no guns, you know, even a lack of time travel credits as in Shadow of Memories, which I reviewed for this channel previously. But, you know, I completely understand nonetheless that this formula isn't for everyone, you know, and I'm also guessing that this was the point of the game that most reviewers started to tune out as well, as just like N64 Magazine mentioned in their review, you know, 20 minutes into this game and you'll very likely be sleeping. However, while the pacing and atmosphere, you know, do remain at a fairly sedate pace throughout, I honestly do have an issue with some of the other main complaints that reviewers had with this game at the time, in particular IGN's review, as there's simply no way, in my opinion, you know, at least from the review that I read, that the reviewer played through the entire game before delivering that harsh judgment. In a review posted June 10th, 1999, IGN criticised both the sedate pacing of this game, fair enough, as well as its abstract puzzle design, targeting two areas of the game in particular, the falling bench and the three statues puzzle, which we'll take a look at now, in which to highlight those issues. Now, while pacing and puzzle design are two perfectly valid criticisms to have with a game, the main issue here is that both criticisms raised by IGN happen within the opening 20 to 30 minutes of the game, probably the opening 10 to 15 minutes if you know what you're doing as well. To have two of your main issues with a game in which both, perfectly coincidentally I'm sure, happen to take place within the opening 20 minutes of said game does raise a huge red flag for me personally, especially in terms of how much of this game was actually sat and played through. Far more bewilderingly designed puzzles, we'll get to those in a bit, take place in later chapters of this game, and it's highly unlikely that you're going to pick these two nondescript early events to form the main critique of your review. Not only that, but the reviewer, we're not going to mention names here,
I'm not a rat,
couldn't even be bothered to actually pay attention to the game during his short playthrough either, declaring in his review that you'll be cursing the game's logic and questioning the value of a proper education while playing it. Now, I'm not sure what esteemed educational establishment our reviewer went to back in the day, but given the severe lack of critical thought on display in this review, I'd be seriously looking for my tuition feedback. The puzzle design in question revolves around three statues that you must place in the correct order so as to open up a doorway to another floor. The issue here is that you'll likely have 5 statues in your possession at this point of the game: an ape man, a primitive human, a normal human, a fairy, and an elf. The human is already in place on the pedestal, so it's just a matter of simply figuring out which of the other 2 statues go alongside it in order to solve the puzzle. Now, while the reviewer states easy, no problem, you know, supposedly he studied anthropology at some stage, he placed the ape and then the primitive human next to the modern human and points out, rightly so, that, you know, this is surely the only logical answer. Yet amazingly, for a person supposedly working for a major video game media company and paid to do in-depth reviews on a daily basis, he doesn't seem to grasp the fact that he's actually playing one. And just as we pointed out in the halfling section earlier on, the rules don't apply here. This is Shadowgate. Shadowgate takes place within its own universe, with its own set of established rules and backstory. So this is not some half-baked real-world Darwinian 5th grade biology class at dipshit high. The biggest factor is that this sole puzzle makes up the main criticism of the entire review, that the puzzles in this game supposedly fly in the face of all accepted reason and logic, not the fact that the reviewer couldn't even be bothered to read a single piece of in-game lore whatsoever, with one of the books that you find immediately prior to the puzzle detailing the full history of all the races in Cal Torlin and how they're all related. The Book of Orders found in the library downstairs of the puzzle room states that, and I quote, "The one, Cal Torlin's version of an all-powerful god, I suppose, first created the Quothra, the fairies first of all, but was displeased with their carefree attitude and focus on pleasure, deciding instead to end them and create a second race, the Johira, the elves. Instead, these were his chosen people for a long time, and the one was happy with them, until chaos subverted the elves and they became corrupted. Only a few elves survived the ongoing future wars, with the elves from the plains eventually becoming humans, the ones from the caves becoming dwarves, and the ones from the north becoming barbarians. Thank you, IGN. Because of this rebuttal, my geek factor has gone up by a further 25%. Now, I'm not saying it's essential by any means to read every single book in the entire game. Many contain merely passing references to some background lore that, oftentimes is non-essential. Think of the kind of books you find in the Elder Scrolls series where, they help to expand the overall mythology of the world. However, what I am saying is that, I believe it's completely disingenuous of any reviewer to critique a game's puzzles and level design when you effectively, couldn't even be bothered to read through 3 minutes of text given to you in a pretty highlighted area immediately prior to said puzzle popping up. That's just lazy reviewing in my opinion. Careless reviews aside, Dell explores the ground floor of the Disciples Tower, running into some spooky children's toys along the way.
That was freaky.
Meeting the wizard Lakmir for the first time. A character that will play a central role throughout the rest of the plot. And of course the bench. We can't forget about the bench. I swear that's the last reference I'll make towards IGN's review in this breakdown. So who is this Lakmir, I hear you ask? Good question. Lakmir is a former druid and master wizard of Castle Shadowgate, the man responsible for guiding the hero of the original Shadowgate game, Lord Jair, to his destiny and defeating the evil warlock Lord Talamar with, possibly the most interesting nugget here being that Lakmir and Talamar were actually once brothers, whether that be by blood or by oath, to their membership of the Circle of 12. If you have any further light to expand upon this point, whether they were brothers by blood or oath, please do so in the comment section below, as in-game sources are pretty slim. They don't really expand all that much upon what was meant by the term brother. From now on, Lakmir will be the main driving force throughout the rest of the campaign, effectively being our Obi-Wan Kenobi, Mr. Miyagi type character, training us up and letting us loose on the main bad guy, approaching the player in visions throughout the rest of the game on no less than 11 separate occasions. The main quest is basically broken down into two main parts, with the initial quarter of the game seeing Dell simply looking for a way to escape from Castle Shadowgate after his nearby cellmate Agar mentioned that they were due for execution. After this initial segment of the game, however, Lakmir shows up and decides we are the one he's been seeking, with our main goal not just to escape anymore, but to stop Lakmir's former apprentice Belzar from raising the Warlock Lord for a second time. Lakmir mentions this fact the first time that we meet him inside the Disciples Tower, saying that he seeks a champion and that if Dell is deemed worthy, he will meet him once again in Lakmir's Tower, the second of the 4 towers in Castle Shadowgate. Upstairs in one of the bedrooms of the Disciples Tower, we find the Pixie Flute, a magical instrument that when played allows us to shrink to the size of a pixie and escape through the downstairs library window. Once outside in the graveyard, Dell quickly makes his way over to the cathedral where, in the catacombs, he finds a dead body clutching a book inside a coffin.
Yeah, nothing creepy about that.
Again, my gamer sense kicked into gear at this point, finding a sleeping corpse inside a coffin, inside a spooky abandoned cathedral no less. This has got to be some sort of surprise vampire attack, but no, nothing happens actually. This is Shadowgate after all, and you leave the room and quietly carry on about your business. Maybe this was one of the parts, if indeed they even made it this far in the game, where the various reviewers who lambasted this game at launch came to their boring conclusions. Almost every outlet that I read at least put the sedate and supposed boring nature of this game as one of their chief criticisms, but you know, for me it was in quirky moments like this where I actually really appreciated Shadowgate 64. You know, it subverted my expectations completely. You know, at the end of the day, this is not Turok Dinosaur Hunter, you know, a game I love by the way, where you're playing as some kind of, you know, tooled up Native American death dealer firing out explosive arrows from your tech bow like, you know, it's a regular day at the fair. This is Shadowgate 64 where, you know, you play as a tiny halfling with absolutely no combat ability whatsoever who, if he gets spotted by an enemy, will be presented with an instant game over, and I'm perfectly fine with that. You know, that relaxing atmosphere from the cathedral crypts is short-lived, however, as climbing up to the cathedral's roof in order to make it over to Lakmir's tower on the other side handed me my first game over screen of the game, stupidly failing to look where I was going and plunging to my death as a result.
That's gonna hurt.
Another really cool aspect this game does well is to personalise death screens as well. Not every non-scripted death in this game is covered, but, you know, a notable number are, and it's refreshing to see, you know, just how much work the developers put into screens which might never have been seen at all. I love this. You know, I love that extra attention to detail and trust of the player, you know, such as the aforementioned Soul Reaver back at the start of the review where, you know, entire sections of the game could be completely missed, you know, especially instead of today's hand-holding, you know, the glowing trails, the yellow paint and so on. You know, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, and many other games of that time were a product of late 90s gaming that allowed the player enough agency and control from the developers to completely miss whole sections of their own game. And, you know, I for one missed that trust. I missed those design choices. But if nothing else, the personalised death screens of this game show the level of effort and care that went into this game from Kemco. Crossing over into the second of the four towers, Lakmir's Tower, sees us meeting the old wizard once again, with our next task being to make it up into his former quarters at the summit of the tower by creating a magical fire in the dining room. Again, this could be perceived as a difficult puzzle on the surface, with little extra instruction being given initially, yet if you can sit through some text, you are given plenty of clues as to the answer in some nearby apprentice books that you can find dotted around the tower. Once you make it upstairs to the old wizard's quarters, he has an additional safety mechanism in place, barring would-be intruders from entering his private chambers via an extremely tough maze. Lakmir leaves you with a rather ambiguous piece of advice in order to navigate his maze as well, namely to follow the knights. Before disappearing once again and leaving you to work out this cryptic message. Honestly, I hated this puzzle. Up to this point of the game, pretty much every single puzzle had been either common sense, you know, requiring some small deduction, or, you know, were contained in clues scattered throughout local books. This was the first puzzle, however, that had neither, you know, at least as far as I could tell. And I had no idea what the hell follow the knights even meant. You know, they all look like knights.
They're all the same.
Through about an hour of trial and error, however, I finally made it up to Lakmir's study, where a star map opened up. No, not that one. On the ceiling of his study, finally enabling us access to his inner sanctum. You can also find Lakmir's personal journal inside this room as well, detailing his sorrow at the former King Lord Jair's passing, as well as the fact that the Warlock Lord is now escaping his prison thanks to the efforts of his former apprentice Belzor. Once inside the inner sanctum, Del comes across 3 distinctly coloured rings, a blue ring, a red ring, and a green ring, with each ring giving Del different strengths and status effects, not all of them beneficial either. It's in this room also where Del gets his first glimpse of Belzor's army arriving at the gates of Castle Shadowgate, highlighting the fact that the Warlock Lord's return is imminent should the young halfling not find a way to stop the summoning. One of the rings we get from Lakmir's inner sanctum allows us to see the dead, an essential item as we'll come to learn, but also it allows us to read blank books as well. Up to this point of the game, your inventory of books should be quite large, as so much of the lore of the game is tied up in books rather than given through in-game dialogue. However, many of the books we picked up to this point have simply been blank, with no way to read them until we had the ability to acquire the red ring, the Ring of the Dead. So hopefully you haven't mistakenly left any blank books behind, thinking that they're worthless. Crossing back over into the cathedral, although being noticeably more careful this time around, I was actually highly impressed with the falling debris coming down from the holes in the roof as well. A really nice graphical touch on a system as limited as the N64 was. After making our way all the way back to the starting area of the game, unlocking doors along the way that were previously closed off to us, which essentially, enables quick travel, Del runs into a grandfather, a dead one, who wants us to find his missing granddaughter, and in return, he'll open up the way outside. However, there's definitely something off with this guy that I can't quite put my finger on. Ghost quests like this one are found scattered throughout Shadowgate, some mandatory and others optional, although most at least have some kind of interesting premise behind them. After talking with the Big H, we can finally make our way outside of the castle walls for the first time in the game, with the outer keep of Castle Shadowgate being comprised of a small town, an inn, a shop, a park, as well as numerous other buildings and rooms that can be explored freely. After heading over to the inn and getting grilled by the local innkeeper about being a potential grave robber,
What's with this guy?
What's with you?
we bump into Agar's sister, the prisoner who was in the cell next to ours back at the start of the game. Agar's sister tasks us with getting her brother out of jail, payment for her supposedly saving her life back at the start of the game, which unfortunately we can't verify. While the rest of our caravan was cut down, I guess we'll have to take her word for it. Before we can get down to the task at hand, however, we have a few things to take care of first, namely finding the granddaughter of the grandfather we just met inside the tower. To do this requires that we find her missing slipper, having to convince a miner along the way to allow us access to where it was last seen, bribing him with a rare coin, only for him then to run off with it. Returning the slipper to the girl enables a very happy reunion between her and her grandfather. However, more importantly for us, it now gets us the Stone of Thirst, which is key to entering the Tower of Trials in the very near future. The Tower of Trials, while not an outright point of no return in the game, does move the game into its final phases, so we need to make sure that we have everything we need in order to complete that task. Back to freeing Agar, we must first go through a series of tasks to do that, befriending a troubadour in order to get a flower, which we then use to place on an old man's grave, who then points us towards his treasure, which is something we'll need to obtain in order to buy an old violin, which will help us in our upcoming prison break of said Agar. See, it turns out that Agar's grunting wall of Agar, the same one who carried us into the castle back at the start of the game, has a particular penchant for classical music.
I didn't see that coming.
Slipping in his old chip violin that he used to play to where he currently resides in the kitchens has him attempting to play one of his old tunes. And honestly, it's probably the only time in the game where your heartbeat will get even a little elevated, as you're forced to hide, run and swipe the key before he manages to finish his tune. Busting Agar out of prison and locking up Mozart the Meathead in the process, you meet both him and his sister back at the Rusty Sword Inn, where they implore you to escape the castle with them. However, Dell's having none of that coward talk, ready to face down and challenge the mighty Belzar in his quest to bring down the evil warlock lord.
Where are you going?
I'm going to pick a fight.
Now the game moves into its final act, with Lakmir finally giving us his full support, telling us we are indeed the one, and with that vote of confidence we can finally enter the Tower of Trials, which is easily the single longest section of the entire game, as well as undoubtedly its hardest. First up is a tricky, although not unreasonable, wall face puzzle, with you having to face 5 consecutive granite wall slabs, each blocking your path and testing your overall knowledge of the game so far, which, as we all know, is the kryptonite of your average IGN reviewer. I swear that's the last one. If you paid attention though, this test really shouldn't provide all that much of a challenge, questioning you about the lore, the characters of the game and so on, as the books contain all the necessary information needed, and the questions are, reasonably straightforward as well. What's not straightforward, however, is the second test, the maze section, a ridiculously difficult segment of the game that, honestly, I'm not even sure is possible without a walkthrough. Maybe if I had a couple of spare months to kill, who knows, maybe I could have eventually figured things out, but unfortunately that just isn't the case. So, after dying and running out of time during this segment in at least the double-digit number of attempts, I was forced to finally turn to trusty old GameFAQs to see me through this one and only section of the game.
Shame.
The first part of the maze, in fairness, isn't all that hard. You're given a major clue earlier in the game as well, back when we picked up the 3 rings in Lakmir's study, that one of them, provided you tried them on, gives the wearer the ability to reverse the controls of the game. Front is back, left is right, and so on. Utterly confusing at first, and I'm thinking, when am I ever going to use this ability? But, the first part of the maze forces the player into using reverse controls against it, against, it must be said, some pretty nasty looking insta-death rotor blades. So, stick that blue ring on, provided you still have it, of course, and this part becomes a doddle. The second part of the maze, however, no ring's going to help you out. The game tasks you with finding a way through a shifting jungle of corridors, stairs, and doors before a candle wick burns out, and it's an incredibly short candle wick as well. This part is just crazy, in fairness. All the doors and walls look the exact same. There's multiple levels on display as well, and even when I did use a walkthrough for this section, I still only barely made it through by the skin of my teeth. So, if you manage to complete this part of the game without any help whatsoever, sir, madame, I salute you.
Salute.
Once at the top of the tower, we can grab the super powerful Ring of the Kingdom, which enables us to open up previously inaccessible areas of the game. And after another pep talk from our old pal Lakmir, it's off to awaken the dragon, although not without some more hiccups along the way.
Why does this keep happening?
The fourth and final tower of Castle Shadowgate, the Dragon's Tower, sees us awaken the last of the dragons. Once the dragon drops us off, the entire town has been overrun by Belzar's dwarven guards, and I always thought dwarves were the good guys, who have the town on full lockdown. And seeing as there's no combat in this game, if you happen to be caught by one of them, it presents an instant game over. Thankfully, a small fire in the stables is enough to draw off their attention, enabling us to sneak into the central chamber of holding in the main part of the castle, where the Warlock Lord is about to be resurrected by Belzar. Unfortunately, we run into the Vampire Lady's son from earlier on in the game, who is blocking the entrance to the central chamber of holding. I probably should have mentioned this earlier on, but at a later point from that first meeting, the Lady of the Ghost in the coffin gives us a pendant to give to her son. Showing him this pendant has him having a change of heart about following Belzar's destructive path, regretting the evil he's done, and taking it upon himself to ward off the dwarven guards as a final act of redemption for all of his sins. Here's hoping his vampire mother can forgive him. Once inside the Chamber of Holding, the game enters its finale. Now, if you've read the in-game books as well as listened to Lakmir's frequent monologues throughout the game also, you've probably learned enough to know that the Staff of Ages and the Staff of Thunder are almost identical in appearance, yet possess very different abilities. While the Staff of Ages is an incredibly powerful artifact, able to resurrect old gods and banish newly risen ones, the Staff of Thunder is basically an uncontrollable nuke, only good for creating massive explosions. Unbeknownst to Belzar, however, he's actually found the Staff of Thunder and not the fabled Staff of Ages. Guess he should have done more reading. And once Del plants the Dragon's Eye in the Staff of Thunder's crown, thereby fooling Belzar completely, the ruse is complete, and Belzar's plan of resurrecting the old god with his weird chanting appears all but doomed. Honestly, as a side note, it's a shame that we didn't get to see more of Belzar in this game, as he actually looks like quite a decent villain. You know, former sorcerer's apprentice gone rogue. It's a time-worn tale, no doubt, at this stage, yet, you know, still remains compelling enough, as nothing gets the narrative juices flowing quite like Betrayal. Yet unfortunately, his character and backstory get explored only briefly, far too briefly in my opinion, and he appears in just 2 cutscenes throughout the entire game. An incredibly wasted opportunity. Despite Belzar's premature death, however, the sorcerer did manage to do enough during the incantation to resurrect the Dark Lord, and now it's up to Del to find a way to put him back down for good. This is probably the coolest section of the entire game, in fairness, as a giant Warlock Lord looms over the entire town, glaring down at our insignificant presence. An image similar to something like the final battle in Elder Scrolls Oblivion, but actually far better done in my opinion, you know, at least in terms of atmosphere. You know, we've got that rain belting down, peals of thunder ripping through the night sky. You really do feel insignificant compared to the Warlock Lord here. However, just like in Oblivion, this is a fight the protagonist can't win alone, and so Del equips both the Staff of Ages and the Ring of the Kingdom on the statue of Lord Jair in the fountain, and watches as the former hero of the first game takes up the mantle once again and dispatches the Dark Lord with a mighty throw of his staff. An argument could be made here similar to Belzar that we didn't see quite enough of the Warlock Lord during the game, but unlike Belzar, I actually have no problem with the Warlock Lord's limited presence throughout the runtime, as it actually ramps things up considerably when he does show up, highlighting just how powerful and otherworldly of an adversary he actually is. Overall, this is a fitting end to Shadowgate 64 in my opinion, and was a pretty rare one too at the time, stripping the player of all agency in terms of landing the final blow themselves on the villain, but, one well managed in my opinion, with Del finally flying off to adventures new as the final credits music kicks in. So, Shadowgate 64, does it still hold up? Yes, it does, at least in my mind. Looking at the initial review scores for this game from some of the major media outlets at the time, 43% from N64 Magazine, a surprising 62% from IGN as well, 46% from GameSpot, and so on. All three criticising the game's pacing and lack of excitement as major reasons to avoid the game, with IGN in particular bemoaning the fact that there was, and I quote, no ass-kicking guns in the game. Despite the absence of said ass-kicking guns, Shadowgate 64 thankfully seems to have been reappraised somewhat across recent years, as at least 5 games, either full-on remakes or remastered re-releases of old games, have come out since 2014, leading to a genuine interest now in the world of Shadowgate and the point-and-click adventure genre as a whole. While Shadowgate 64 certainly isn't immune to criticism, its pace is slow at the end of the day, there's no getting around that fact. There's an over-reliance on text as well, not just to work out what's going on during puzzle segments, but also to understand pretty much anything in regards to the background lore of the game as well, along with any of its characters. And even if you can get past these minor faults, the game has one or two insanely difficult puzzles to navigate as well that, without a guide, especially for the maze part, I likely wouldn't have had this review out for another 12 months, but if you can forgive those issues and you're not too heavily invested in ass-kicking guns, then there's a lot to like here. There's a really deep story to uncover, especially concerning the wizard Lakmir and his relationship to Lord Jair. The atmosphere and general ambience of the game is incredible in my opinion as well, especially in certain segments. And while the game might be over-reliant on text-heavy books, what's in there is reminiscent of the kind of deep book lore that a game like Morrowind possesses. No spoiler for what I'll be covering next on this channel. Maybe not quite up to that same Elder Scrolls standard, but pretty deep nonetheless, and if you can get invested in its world, then Shadowgate 64 will reward you with an experience that is quite unlike anything else you'll find on the N64. Let me know your own thoughts down below about Shadowgate 64. Did you play this game back in the day, or would you recommend any of its newer PC releases, or indeed its original forebear on the NES to play through? As always, thank you for taking the time to watch and like the video. It's always appreciated. And until next time, holding out.